Catholic Church's social action is really founded on 4 sources. First source is Scripture. Secondly is human experience, collective experience, individual experience. Thirdly, the lives and the witnesses of saints. And finally, on the experience and the knowledge that's developed from the human and social sciences. Perhaps I'll just focus on the first source, Scripture. If you look at the Old Testament, there's a number of things that are striking. If you look in the book of Genesis, right at the very beginning, you see chaos, darkness, seas that are unchained. And God sends the Spirit there, the Ruah, to bring order into chaos, and begins to create divisions between light and dark, day and night. God brings order into chaos, recognizing that for human beings, in their relationships, whether it be with nature, or whether it be among themselves, or within the individual person, there's a need for bringing a certain degree of order. A certain degree of order that is the secret of harmony. You also see in the book of Genesis these fantastic narratives that speak about human relationships, complex human relationships, broken human relationships. Think of the relationship between Adam and Eve. What's the first thing that Adam does? He blames Eve for having got him into trouble. Does that sound familiar as a guy? Think also about how much jealousy can push human beings to destroy another. Cain and Abel. But what's also remarkable in the story of Cain and Abel is how Abel, who cries out after he has been identified as his brother's killer, is accorded protection by God. He wears a mark on his forehead that protects him against vengeance by others. And at the moment, we're in the midst of Restorative Justice Week. And I think this particular story of Cain and Abel, and especially the protection that God gives to Cain, who's guilty of a very serious crime, says something about our obligations towards people who've committed serious crimes, and also the need of protection of victims of violence. I go on a little bit more. I can think, for example, in the story of Noah. Sometimes you don't recognize that right after the flood, Noah gets drunk. And for those of us who have had a relative or a friend who's had to deal with alcoholism or a major drug problem, it's important to see, for example, in the book of Genesis, this dimension of the complexity of human experiences, the difficulties, the challenges of also caring for persons who are older and in loss of certain capacities. One of my favorite stories in the book of Genesis is the story of Joseph, his father's favorite son, who is sold by his brothers into slavery. And through a whole set of circumstances, Joseph one day becomes entrusted with a great deal of power, eventually capable of saving his brothers and their families. What I love in that story is especially the reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers, and the return of Joseph to his father, Jacob. I find that very, very powerful, says a great deal. If we move from the book of Genesis, you go into Exodus, and you see how God listens to the cry of the poor. The Hebrew slaves that are feeling oppression, being used as animals to essentially build an empire. And God hears the cry of the poor and sends someone, a man who feels that he's not able to meet this challenge, Moses. Sends Moses and says, Moses, you do it. You carry out this action. And it's extraordinary, this story. And then, of course, how God reveals at the Sinai experience his solicitude for his people in offering them 10 words, the 10 commandments. It's important to keep in mind how these words or these commandments were seen by the people of Israel as a gift that was entrusted to them by God. A gift that they were privileged to have received, and that secured for them a way of living in a harmonious relationship. It's important to think about the Decalogue also in terms of, for example, the Jubilee tradition that calls for the release of slaves, forgiveness of debt, and the protection of the earth. And also the tradition to be found also in the Old Testament about the need to protect widows and orphans, and especially strangers, and how in the book of Kings we are told to remember that we are all at one point or another strangers in a strange land. The Psalms for me are the cry of the person who is poor, who is excluded, the person who is crushed by the burdens of daily life or by a great injustice, who cries out to God, who calls God to intervene. Where are you, God, in the midst of this situation that I'm in? I'm out of work, or I have a problem with this and this compulsion, or why is it that my beloved is suffering from illness? Where are you, God? The Psalms are that cry of the poor. And we hear that same cry in the book of Job. When we move into the New Testament, we see a Jesus who was close to those persons who were marginalized by people in positions of power, the people who were excluded by religious authorities. Jesus is close to women. Jesus is close to people who are seen as of ill repute. Jesus, whenever he's about to speak, to proclaim a dimension of the kingdom, always begins by healing somebody, an exorcism, cleansing somebody from a disease like leprosy that would marginalize the person, or healing the person from a psychiatric torment. This Jesus who is present with those persons who are vulnerable, that are marginalized, that are excluded. And also Jesus was present to kids, to children. Even when in that particular culture, that kind of contact was seen as wasteful. But Jesus could recognize in that child a gift from God. And Jesus goes right to the end of his commitments, right to the end of his convictions, and pays the price for it. Betrayed, tortured, and eventually hung from the cross, which was the sanction for traitors and runaway slaves. But that's not the end of the story. God, through the Spirit, raises Jesus from the dead, and in so doing says that the values that Jesus espoused, the options that Jesus had, the way of living his life really reflected the tenderness of the Father, that Jesus was speaking God's truth. I think it's really very, very powerful. If we move into the writings of St. Paul, we see in Paul a sense of the community of the people of God constituting a body, a single body. If somebody is hurt or oppressed or marginalized, it is the whole community, the whole people of God that are suffering, the whole of creation that is damaged. This relationship of interdependence. We are one body. We are one body. And then also, for example, if you look in the Acts of the Apostles, you see the echo of this message that comes in the book of Deuteronomy, that there must not be a poor or any excluded among us. The idea of creating a new people where people live together, of respect, and also in a spirit of sharing the gifts and the wealth that is entrusted to us.